Welcome back to the Deep 404. Are we on the verge of a war between the US and Iran? This is a question which I think a lot of people are asking after Sunday's developments with a drone attack on a US base in Jordan. The aftermath and the outcome of that attack, what appears to be a single drone attack on a US base called Tower 22 on the border of Jordan and Syria, may well be moving us closer to a major confrontation in the Middle East, and ultimately one involving US directly engaging Iran. The US Secretary of State Tony Blinken, he has said earlier today, I would argue that we've not seen a situation as dangerous as the one we're facing now across the region since at least 1973, and arguably even before that, and that is the environment in which we're operating. Blinken there with 1973 referring to the Yom Kippur War or the Ramadan War, when Arab nations and Israel fought. So right now, Joe Biden, the President of the United States of America, is deciding what America's response will be to this attack. Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has said we will respond, and that response could be multi-leveled, come in stages and be sustained over time. He said this today in a joint press conference he was holding with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He goes on to say the President has been crystal clear. We will respond decisively to any aggression, and we will hold responsible the people who attacked our troops. We will do so at a time and a place of our choosing. The US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who now is recovering and becoming visible again after his urinary tract infection or injury. He has said that Iran-backed militias are responsible for these continued attacks on US forces, and we will respond at a time and place of our choosing. Earlier today, White House spokesperson for national security John Kirby has spoken. He has said that Washington is not looking for a war with Iran, but this doesn't carry a great deal of weight. He has recently said this about the Houthis in Yemen, that Washington doesn't want a war with them, but there has been ongoing bombing of the Houthis' positions in Yemen for a couple of weeks now. There has been confusion around this attack. There has been a number of elements that have been confusing, and perhaps surprisingly so. First of all, the original messaging that came out was that this attack had occurred in Jordan at Tower 22, this base reportedly with about 350 US reservists, a supply and logistics base in Jordan, and about 30 kilometers away from a base called tanf in Syria. Now, one of the confusing elements of this issue has been the way that the reporting has flipped around as to where this attack occurred. Originally, the US stated that this had occurred at a base in Jordan. Then the Jordan Minister of Government Communications, Mohammad Mubaddin, he made a statement that the attack targeting US forces near the Syrian border did not take place within Jordan, but instead targeted Tanf base in Syria. News reporting mentioned Tanf for most of yesterday as being the location. Today, when I was preparing notes for this video, I noticed that a lot of news reporting tends or seems to have been updated. More recent reports from those news sites are now calling it Jordan. But if you go back and look at, for example, if you go back and look at Twitter, something like, X, And the posts that have been made there, you will see there are still a lot of replies there talking about this attack having occurred in Tanf. So some interesting confusion there, some speculation as to where the attack actually did occur, and why the Jordanians may have been saying that it wasn't in Jordan at Tower 22 and that it was in Syria at Al Tanf. These bases, as I say, are 20 kilometres apart. The Syrian Al Tanf base allegedly holds about 200 special operations, special ops forces, whereas Tower 22 contains reservists, reportedly in supply and logistics. How did it happen? Well, it's not clear. The current preliminary report, which the Wall Street Journal is speaking about, suggests that a single drone struck the base. It may have struck a barracks where the US forces were sleeping. And this explains how there was such a large number of men reportedly injured by this one single drone. The questions then arise, well, how did the drone get through? Is there a problem with air defense at these bases? One part of the preliminary report is suggesting that, in fact, what has happened is that the US had their own drone out and they were expecting its return. And at the time they were expecting its return, this enemy drone was able to enter the base and was not stopped, not intercepted, because there was confusion. Now, this would indicate this is not good for the US air defense systems if this has happened. Confusion about whether it's our drone or an enemy drone. If this is the case, it is some sort of mix-up between the friend or foe system, then this adds credence to some of the reports we've seen recently in Russia, where Russia, the IL-76, that was damaged by an air defense missile but landed, and the Russian pilot, ultimately died. That was the Russians claimed that was a problem with the friend or foe system. So perhaps that's what has happened here for the Americans. Even so, if that is the case, that doesn't look great. Is that a cover story to explain inadequate air defense or inadequate training, perhaps? And that story about them expecting their own drone to come in was what caused this to happen. Was the attack larger than one drone? And all of them made it through. And the story about one drone is just being presented. So again, the air defense capabilities don't look to be weakened or unsuitable. John Helmer, who has a website, Dancing with Bears, I will just read a little bit from there. He talks about another theory of what may have happened here. So he says, this is a significant accomplishment that he's quoting a Pentagon source. Was the bypassing of the US air defense system at Tower 22 pulled off with Russian assistance? US bases generally rely on the CRAM, counter-rocket artillery and mortar system. Now, the CRAM system was sent to Ukraine last year to be used there to help Ukrainians defend positions. This has given the Russians an opportunity to encounter the CRAM system in the wild and to learn how to defeat it. Helmer's latest article goes on to say this is the American electronic warfare capabilities. They've been doing a fair job, of knocking down drones up until now. It seems a coincidence that not a week after the meetings in Moscow with Arabs and Iranians that we see this success. It is a success, the circumstances of which we can be sure Biden and Austin are not keen to advertise. He goes on further to say that this attack, if it has occurred on Tower 22, now demonstrates that Tower 22 and our tanf in Jordan and Syria are vulnerable now to weapons which the US forces have now been shown to fail to either detect or to neutralize. In terms of the impact of what actually happened with this strike, look, at least 3 people have been reported as being killed, which is tragic for their families, of course. 8 have been reported as being evacuated with life-threatening injuries. This is according to CENTCOM, the US Central Command. And about 3 dozen more have been counted as wounded. Again, these numbers not consistent. Some suggesting that 34 service members were being treated for possible traumatic brain injuries. So I mentioned this is a strange term which has been popping up a number of times in these attacks which have been going on in US bases in Iraq and Syria. About a week or so ago, there were reports there. 2 people who had suffered traumatic brain injuries again. There have been about 150 to 160 of these attacks since the October 7th Hamas attacks in Israel, and the subsequent Israeli response has led to this escalation in attacks on US bases in Iraq and Syria. Again, in some other reporting on what happened here in terms of the impact, we've had 34 mentioned and 3 dozen plus 11, 21, so 32. Another report, the Pentagon said that more than 40 troops were wounded in the attack, most with cuts, bruises, brain injuries, and similar wounds. 8 were medically evacuated, including 3 who were going to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. The other 5, who suffered minor traumatic brain injuries, were expected to return to duty. No indication is given as to when they may return to duty. There's some confusion. There's some interesting fog of war going on around this attack, and I think it's probably got something to do with, as Helmer is suggesting, that whatever the cause has, this has demonstrated a new weakness for the Americans in their bases and their base security. And if it is something which is now perhaps due to the ability to overcome the CRAM system, then that puts other bases that are relying on this for their air defence protection at risk also. Very, very interesting here. So what is next? Just a little bit on Jordan. Now, Jordan's leadership is an ally with the United States and Israel. But about 6 million Palestinians live in Jordan. About 50% thereabouts of the population is Palestinian. Many of those Palestinians in Jordan have their origins of being in Jordan due to fleeing the Palestine area in the conflicts in 1948 and 1967 in Israel, leaving as refugees. So perhaps Jordan's positioning that this did not occur in Jordan is a way for them to move the activity and any responses to this away from Jordan, to position it firmly in Syria and hope that that keeps them out of any US strikes or retaliation. Perhaps the US want to hide the fact that the attack occurred on tanf and special forces have been wounded and injured there. This is of course just speculation. I don't know, and I don't think anyone's quite clear exactly on exactly what is going on here yet. John Helmer has gone on just to note in his article about this that it's been reported that the Iranian naval drone carrier and electronic warfare, the Shah Mahdavi, is now in the Gulf of Oman, and that this could effectively close the Straits of Hormuz if the US were to strike Iranian targets. So Iranian have naval presence in the area where all the oil flow happens. If the US response is against Iran, perhaps directly against Iran or against Iranian assets outside of Iran, the nation itself, then perhaps Iran then will respond with its own activities through the Persian Gulf and these areas, further restricting the supply of oil and products through those areas. The attacks could be direct attacks on Iran. They could be attacks on Iranian assets, as I say, outside of Iran, perhaps the Navy itself, the Iranian Navy, or perhaps, hopefully, more likely, these attacks from the Americans will be limited to the Iranian proxies in Iraq and Syria. Biden himself has said radical Iranian-backed militant groups are operating in Syria and Iraq. The US position at this stage, perhaps emotionally reacting, seems to be very aggressive. We have people like Senator Lindsey Graham coming out and posting on X, hit Iran, hit them hard. Today, Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary Sabrina Singh at a news briefing said, "We hold Iran responsible as they are supporting these groups that continue to inflict casualties on our forces, whether it be in Jordan, Iraq or Syria. We absolutely hold Iran responsible because we know that they fund and train and support and equip these militias that operate in Iraq and Syria." When she was asked whether Iranian leaders coordinated the attack, this is the Deputy Pentagon Press Secretary, Sabrina Singh, "I don't have more to share in terms of an intelligence assessment on if leaders in Iran were directing this attack, but what I can tell you is that we know these groups are supported by Iran, and therefore they do have their fingerprints on this, but I can't tell you more in terms of who directed the attack." What is Iran's position on this? Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani has called baseless the US claims that Iran was involved or directed these attacks. Kanani has said resistance groups do not take orders from the Islamic Republic. And earlier today, Iran's mission to the United States issued a statement saying that Iran had no connection and had nothing to do with the attack on the US base. It added, "There is a conflict between US forces and resistance groups in the region which reciprocate retaliatory attacks." So Iran firmly of the position they did not do this, they did not coordinate or command or direct this. They do, of course, accept that there are militias which they may back and support in the area in conflict with the Americans. So Biden's response to this, which we're expecting to hear about any time now, could really set the course of events for the world for decades to come. If what he presents is a measured, restrained, thoughtful response that involves dialogue and some diplomacy with the Iranians, then we might see a general de-escalation in the Middle East. If it is an aggressive, arrogant response, and something that may even include direct attacks on Iran, then we may be about to enter the largest global conflict that we have seen since World War II. So it's a very precarious time that we are at right now, it seems. Perhaps just one voice of reason in the US side of things here. General Charles Q. Brown Jr., the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when asked about this conflict, he said, "We don't want to go down a path of greater escalation that drives to a much broader conflict within the region." He was asked whether he thought Iran wanted war with the United States, and he said, "No, I don't think so." And hopefully he is right and that Iran doesn't want to escalate this conflict. And hopefully within the United States, people are listening to him and people of his position that the US does not want to get into a conflict with Iran, which will lead to a far broader and devastating, quite likely global conflict. The big risk here is that the US and Iran may start things, but it may not end with just those two involved, and we may see other parties drawing in and expanding the conflict. Turkey getting involved, depending on how things go, possibly even Russia getting involved. So, all right, I'll leave that there for now. I hope you're having a good night. I hope the news we get the next day or so about this is good news that leads to this de-escalating. But I do feel that there is a real chance that we will see an escalation in the Middle East and a global conflict arising out of it.